Alright, this will be my last guide on the Boulder Super League, where I'll just be summarizing all the fights, going over their gimmicks, and just providing some tips to help you clear these stages without needing a full video guide for the individual fight. So first of all, how do you get there? Go to your travelogue, select Boulder Super League, and now you can teleport over. Alternatively, you can go to this Fight Club teleportation point and walk across the road. If you cannot enter the Boulder Super League, you need to talk to Scott to do the related side quests first. There are 2 or 3 of them, but they do provide some nice EXP. Now, once inside the Fight Club, you talk to Dr. Dig. You say, I want to join, and now you can select your difficulty. So, for the rewards, you can get up to 600 Stellar Jades, 100 through first clears, and 500 through objectives, as well as a nice amount of character and light code EXP. Because you get 24 of these traveler guides and 16 of these refined aethers just for clearing within 30 rounds. If you can do it within 15 rounds, that's even more character and light code XP, as well as the highly coveted relic XP, which you are probably sorely lacking at this point in the game, because relics are expensive, and you need them for so many characters. For clearing within 8 rounds, you get 20,000 credits per round for a total of 100,000 credits for clearing all of them within 8 rounds. I wouldn't say to stress yourself too much if you can't do a stage within 8 rounds. It's only 20k credits, which is a pretty nice amount, but it's also only like 15 to 20 energy, so you can easily get it, so you're not missing out as much as if you missed out on the Stellar Jades, or even the Traveler's Guide, which is a lot more energy to get those 8 Traveler Guides. Now, for the difficulties, there are 5 difficulties, but they are not sorted based on the difficulty of the fight, because I found lightweight and middleweight to be the more difficult fights to do within 8 turns, especially for free-to-play units, because they actually required some investment in your teams, instead of just relying on the gimmicks of the stage buffs like the other 3 difficulties. Alright, the first fight is the Featherweight difficulty, and the trial character you get is Jing. He is an amazing 5-star DPS that can carry you through these stages as the only DPS you'll need. For the most part, you just need a DPS for the first stage and maybe the 4th, because the main gimmick around Featherweight is Weakness Break, which is centered around the Imperil buff, which is upon breaking an enemy's weakness, it triggers all debuffs that would have been inflicted if all their type weaknesses were broken, and deals the corresponding DOTs. This is the second buff you pick up, and means that for the second and third stage you can one-shot enemies just by weakness breaking them. For the 4th stage it will half health the enemies, meaning that you need to weakness break them twice to win the stage, but that also means you don't need to bring any DPS of your own, just weakness breaking characters. Other buffs that are useful are the Premonition buff, which upon entering battle, inflicts 1 weaknesses that correspond to allied types to all enemies. This is the first buff you get, and can be useful for guaranteeing a type advantage if you bring all of the same element, or at least a majority of a single element. Thing to note about this buff is that you can just exit and re-enter a stage with no repercussions, just to reroll the weaknesses the enemies get, because if you exit a stage, you just re-enter at the same stage, and you don't get any penalties to your turn counter or anything like that. For the 4th stage, the Depredate buff is the core buff, which after an ally inflicts weakness break on an enemy, it depletes all enemies' toughness to 0 and causes them to be weakness broken. This means that you just need to attack one of the bosses to break the other boss's weakness. A few things to note about the 4th stage is not to attack or not to break the weaknesses of one boss while the other's toughness bar is depleted, because the fire or the blaze out of space when he's weakness broken is frozen for a turn, which is really annoying because it delays when he recovers his toughness bar. So if you break the other boss's toughness bar before the blaze out of space recovers, you're just killing one boss and then spending an extra turn to kill the other, instead of killing them both in the same turn. For some team recommendations, if you just want a free-to-play team, you can go with Trailblazer Fire, Asta, Serval, and Jing. This is a great team because fire and lightning are just great elements for these stages because the third boss is weak to both, so there's no RNG there. While the fourth boss is weak to fire, meaning it's guaranteed to get the lightning weakness, which means your characters are gonna both be effective against that one boss. And as I discussed earlier, you just need to break one of those boss's toughness bars in order to break them both. Another great thing about this team is there's a lot of AoE, which is great for weakness breaking the enemies quickly, as opposed to like a bunch of single target hunt units, which might be able to carry the stage on their own, but they're not taking advantage of the stage's gimmicks. Alright, the next difficulty you'll face is the lightweight challenge, and this is one of the harder difficulties because you need a little bit more investment in your own units, and also it heavily favors single target damage dealers, meaning if you have not upgraded one of those, you're going to be struggling to get this stage in under 8 turns. The trial character for this stage is Hook. Hook provides some pretty decent DPS, but is by no means optimal for this challenge. She's an alright choice if you lack any strong single target DPS, but honestly you'd be better off with any hunt unit like a Danhang or a Sushang or any of the 5 stars. So let's move on to the buffs now. All the buffs in this stage are centered around single target damage, which is largely due to the first buff Misdirection, which increases crit rate of allies' single target abilities by 100%. This is a pretty big buff because it means that all single target abilities are guaranteed to hit, and also that you can change your gear around, so you don't even have to worry about crit rate at all. The second most important buff is the Destructive Rush, which increases crit damage from allies by 240%. This is just a really nice damage buff and makes getting through stages a lot easier if you don't have a lot of investment in your DPS. The third buff is Bathe in Blood, which is when an ally attacks with a single target ability. It additionally regenerates 20 energy. This is great for a low energy unit like a Danhang because he's going to get his ultimate on his first turn when he uses his skill. This is pretty big for the boss battles. The fourth unit is Divide and Conquer, and it's if there are exactly 1 enemies on the battlefield, it increases damage dealt by 300%. This is a pretty nice boost, but honestly it just means that erudition units are even worse because they'll be killing enemies at the same time. Alright, for the team recommendations. I'd say Danhang is a pretty good choice regardless of how much you've spent because he just has good type matchups against all the enemies in these stages. Plus he has a really low ult energy cost, so he can get his ult off really quick thanks to that Bathe in Blood buff. If you just want to go with free-to-play options, Hook is a pretty good unit despite all her drawbacks. Because she does provide some pretty decent DPS, you just need to work around her ultimate, turning her skill into a blast type ability. But if you have other hunt units through your pulls, they would be better choices. Fire or physical trailblazer are both good here, depending if you need extra damage or extra defense. If you need the extra damage, physical trailblazer works good enough. But yeah, and then for the last unit, you probably want Asta, because you don't really need an offensive unit for these stages, and the extra buffs can be nice. A lot of these characters can be subbed out if you have better characters from your pulls, but this is just a free-to-play team. The next difficulty is the Welterweight challenge, and in my opinion, it is a lot easier than the Lightweight challenge because the buffs actually provide some substantial DPS, instead of just providing a bunch of high multipliers that you need good base stats to take advantage of in the first place, like the lightweight difficulty. And speaking of buffs, the stage is all about ultimate spam, follow-up attack boosts, and weakness break boosts. And to take advantage of all that, ultimates are all considered follow-up attacks, and when you weakness break an enemy, you fully recharge everybody's ultimate gauges. This is really good, and for the trial character they provide you with, it is Serval. Serval does not have any innate follow-up attacks, but she does have pretty good energy regeneration, further boosted by the Light Cone, which gives her 20 energy upon entering battle, and her second limit break, which additionally regenerates even more energy. So while she may not be a follow-up unit, she does get her ult up enough to take full advantage of the follow-up buffs. Now let's move on to the buffs. The first buff you get is Indiscriminate Blitz, which is when an ally uses their ultimate, it is considered as a follow-up attack, and increases the damage of follow-up attacks by 200%. This is a very, very crazy first buff, because that means that all ultimates do 200% more damage, as well as follow-up attacks, and there are some pretty good follow-up attack units that can take full advantage of this. If you're using the trial character Serval, her skill regenerates enough energy to use her ultimate immediately after, so you can pretty much wipe through stages 1 and 2 with pretty much Serval alone. For the second buff you get, it increases the crit rate of allies' follow-up attacks by 100%. Again, this is a pretty crazy buff because that means your ultimates are now doing 200% more damage and guaranteed to crit 100% of the time. For the third stage, you get Hot Pursuit, which increases the weakness break efficiency of follow-up attacks by 300%. Doesn't look like too much on its own, but it leads into the fourth stage, where you get Arsonist Larceny buff, which is when an ally inflicts weakness break on an enemy, it regenerates all allies' energy to the maximum. This buff is just, it pairs so well with all the other buffs that you've gotten so far. And even better is that on the fourth stage, the bosses actually summon adds during the battle, so you can regenerate your energy off weaker enemies to fully recharge your ultimates to take down the bosses. In my opinion, this is a really well designed stage with a lot of good buffs that you can take advantage of and easily clear it out. Now we'll move on to the team building. You'll firstly want a unit that can prioritize follow-up attacks, so Herta would be a great choice here because she gets a lot of good boosts from the stage. But if you haven't built her up, she's not really a must-have unit. And of course, if you have Jing, he's gonna completely obliterate the stage with his passive, dealing 200% more damage with a 100% crit rate. If you're looking for a free-to-play team, Fire Trailblazer and the Trial unit are of course pretty good units. Then you can go Herta if you have her built up. And probably a Dan Hang for some strong single target damage. If you don't want to use either of these, Asta is also a pretty good damage support, while QQ is pretty good because Quantum Fire and Lightning are really good elements here, and also her ultimate will be hitting super hard due to all the buffs provided. Alright, the next difficulty is the Middleweight challenge, and this is another one of the harder ones because it does require you to have a decent amount of investment in your own characters, because it doesn't provide a lot of damage buffs until the last stage where you get a 600% damage buff. What that means for the first 3 stages, you're running with little to no damage buffs. For the trial character, they give you Gepard. Gepard is a great unit for almost all content in this game, but I cannot say he greatly excels in this stage, because for the most part you just want to generate as many shields as possible or get as many turns as possible so that you can generate your own shields. Gepard only generates a shield for everyone on his ultimate, so he pretty much gets beat out by Fire Trailblazer in every aspect. And to further make it worse, he doesn't have a very good light cone. If he had his signature light cone or a better preservation light cone, he might have been more viable. But honestly, you're just better off going with Fire Trailblazer because they take more advantage of the gimmicks of this stage, unless you want to use them both to try to rush that +6 overbreathing stacks. And speaking of overbreathing, let's go over the buffs. The first buff you get is the Fortitude of Mind and Spirit, which is after an ally uses their skill or ultimate, they gain a shield that can absorb damage equal to 30% of their max HP for 2 turns. This is a decent skill if you're running units that can move multiple turns or units that can give other units multiple turns because they can generate their own shields for the overbreathing stack that you get in the second fight. Now speaking of overbreathing, that is the second buff we get, which is when an ally gains a shield, they also gain 1 stack of overbreathing, which increases crit rate by 15%, stacking up to 6 times. This doesn't sound like a lot right now, but it gets further built upon with the next few buffs. The third buff is when an ally's overbreathing reaches 3 and 6 stacks respectively, their energy regenerates to maximum and they immediately gain an action. This is a really good buff because it means that your units can basically alt 2 to 3 times on their first turn and move 3+ times on their first turn, because they immediately gain an action and they get max energy every time they reach the 3 and 6 stacks. And to make the buffs even better, on the 4th stage, when an ally's overbreathing reaches 6 stacks, their damage is increased by 600%. This is a really good buff, but the enemies are super tanky on the 4th stage, so you don't really notice it that much, so really just evens out in the end. A few notes is the sudden impact, which is when your allies regain their energy and gain another action. Make sure to use your units to attack in between ultimate uses, because you don't want to waste a turn because you've been spamming ultimates and got your units to +6 when they haven't even moved from their buff on +3. Alright, for the team building, Fire Trailblazer is probably a unit that you're going to want on any team because she generates a small shield with her basic and skill, and also a shield on her ultimate. This means in one turn she can generate 2 shields for the entire team, giving everyone 2 overbreathing stacks if you regenerate her ultimate energy on the first turn. For a free-to-play team, you'll probably want to go with Gepard next. While he doesn't provide a lot to this stage, you can combine it with Fire Trailblazer to essentially loop their overbreathing stacks with the 3rd buff of recharging their ultimates, so that everyone on the team can get +6, so you can get that +6 damage boost on the 4th stage on the first turn if possible. For other units that you'd want to run, Dan Hang is a pretty good unit for that single target DPS, and also he's going to get a lot of ults, so he's going to be doing a lot of damage. Another option for your 4th unit, I would suggest a Serval possibly, although a QQ or an Asta are also good choices as well. But again, for most stages, I do not recommend defensive supports because you don't really need them unless you're struggling. And of course, if you have any other gacha units that are damage dealers, they're going to benefit a lot from these buffs because they're going to be ult spamming very often. Alright, the final stage of the Boulder Town Super League is the Heavyweight Challenge. This one is surprisingly easy considering it went after the Middleweight Challenge, which was a fair amount of difficulty, but still manageable. It's more on par with Featherweight and Welterweight difficulties, but maybe a little bit more above that because it does require a little bit of investment. But all in all, it's a pretty easy stage. The trial unit they provide you with in this stage is Himiko. If you recall from the tutorial, she has a great talent which, upon inflicting weakness break 3 times, she unleashes a follow-up attack which is a fire AoE on all enemies. This is a pretty powerful attack for these stages because this is a weakness break type stage and has a lot of the same buffs as the Featherweight difficulty. To further boost her effectiveness, she has this light cone, which means she has 20 more energy upon entering battle and 32% ultimate damage boost. Honestly, she's a great unit for a majority of teams, but especially a fire team, because you can build a full-on fire team to make sure all enemies have the fire weakness, making her very, very effective in these stages. Alright, so for the buffs, it's a weakness breaking stage and has a lot of the same buffs as the Featherweight difficulty, starting with the Premonition buff, which upon entering battle inflicts 1 weaknesses that correspond to ally types to all enemies. This is a great buff with the trial unit Himiko, because we already have 2 free fire units just from Asta and Fire Trailblazer, so it's really easy to build a fire-centered team and take advantage of the trial unit's passive. For the second buff, we get Thwack. Thwack increases the weakness break efficiency of allies by 200%, and when inflicting weakness break on an enemy, the enemy's action is delayed by 100%. This helps to reduce the enemy's DPS while also increasing your weakness break efficiency. For the third buff, we have Hunch. Hunch increases damage dealt to enemies with weakness break by 500%. This is a pretty big buff because that means enemies that are weakness broken are going to take 500% more damage, which means that it really works well with the Thwack buff where enemies' actions are delayed by 100% because they'll be weakness broken for a longer period of time. For the fourth buff, you get the Depredate buff, which after an ally inflicts weakness break on an enemy, They deplete all enemies' toughness to 0 and causes them to be weakness broken. This is another great buff for the 4th stage because the boss does summon minions that do not get affected by the premonition buff, so just weakness breaking the boss is enough to weakness break all the minions on the screen. Alright, for team recommendations. For a free-to-play team, it's really easy to build up a fire team with Trailblazer Fire, Asta, and Heimko. For the 4th unit, if you have a hook, that's just a really good unit. But if you don't, the other free options are Dan Hang, Serval, or QQ. I do not recommend the defensive supports unless you need them, and if none of these options sound good to you, of course an offensive support or another DPS could work as well. And that is all for the Boulder Town Super League guide. Thanks for watching, and I will probably upload more content on the Memory of Chaos next, because that's just the next most difficult content that might be deserving of content. But I will also be trying to get videos out on new events that happen in the future, so look forward to those. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.